Okay, well, good morning, everyone. My name is Elena Rogers, and I am one of two area specialized agents with NC State University that focus on produce safety. So today we're going to talk about addressing food safety risk and flooding issues after Hurricane Helene. And so we're obviously going to focus on the produce industry. We're going to focus on growers, large and small, that grow fresh fruits and vegetables. And we'll discuss how the storm impacted our production in Western North Carolina. And this is a presentation I put together with Dr. Lynette Johnston after the storm, based on all the work that we did for this, and with the help of many county agents in the region that, that work with us. So to start, I do want to make a differentiation between pool water and flood water, because that's where the FDA guidance leads us, okay? And so the first thing is that anytime we have a flood, when we have rain, when we have a lot of water in a field, we do need to understand the differences between these two terms. The first one is pool water. So that is when there are times when we will have excessive rainfall. It is not unusual to get a 5-inch rainfall event in the spring, or, during this growing season. And so at that point in time, we have a lot of water, the soil gets saturated. And what happens is that we might have standing water in fields. This type of water, this type of situation where it's called pool water, basically, where you have a heavy downpour. And this is not necessarily or represents a risk for food safety. Okay, we normally consider that a typical event. Once the soil, the rain dries out, the soil will be fine, and we should not expect any major contamination from especially from human pathogens. Okay. So where we do have problems is when we see this scenario, when we have floodwaters come into production areas where we are growing fresh fruits and vegetables. This is a more severe, and it occurs. The distinction between pooling and flooding is that floodwaters are coming from outside sources. They are coming from areas where obviously beyond the farmer's control, and where that water comes from probably a river, a creek that flooded, a lake, and that water is likely to contain harmful bacteria and other contaminants that can affect the safety of the produce that we are growing in that area. So this is a picture of like flooding that occurred during Hurricane Helene. You can see where the river actually came into a production area. So as we move forward, there are a couple of things that we need to think about. The question that everyone had, as growers started calling us, was like, is my crop safe? And obviously we need to make a distinction between, was your field flooded, or was it just water that got pulled in that field? Because obviously we had in some areas over 5, 10, 20 inches of rain. And so normally it's fairly easy to be able to make that distinction and to say like, hey, my field was flooded, or my field was pooled. When the fields are flooded, okay, well, in both instances, actually, it's never a bad thing to do an assessment, okay? And just because we want to, if especially if floodwaters came close to your field, okay, maybe the field didn't get flooded, but it's still important to answer a few of these questions. And the first one was, is the edible portion of the crop, did it come in direct contact with floodwaters? Okay. What if, even when, let's say, like the field did not get flooded, but if water came close to the field, or to the area where plants are growing, how did that happen? How far did that flood water come from the crop? And so that will obviously lead some of the actions that we will take later, or some of the decision making process. And the other big question that we got is like, okay, so I may have not had a crop growing in the area, but my production fields got flooded. So when can I replant? What do I need to do? How do I know it's safe to proceed? So these are three of the questions that we will basically answer through this presentation. Here is a summary of the FDA guidance. So the FDA does have an official document where they give us very general guidance as to what to do when we have flooding events. Again, flooding events is what we're concerned about. So they do very clearly state, and I feel obviously this event is, now past us. It's been a few months, but this is important to keep in mind as we move forward, especially if you grow fresh fruits and vegetables. So you should never harvest any produce that came in direct contact with floodwaters. That produce is considered adulterated, so it is illegal to put that produce in commerce and to make it available for human consumption. In some instances, it can be used for food, for animal food, but that is like, you do need to, follow up and look at those, at that part of the regulation and see what you're allowed to do and not allowed to do based on the extent of the flooding. Now, if the flooded field where the edible portion, let's see, so where you have a flooded field, but the edible portion of the crop did not come in contact with flood waters, that's like another common scenario. So let's say that we have a tomato field and you might have had minor flooding. So you might have seen that the field got flooded, but the actual tomatoes growing on top of the plant may have not been in contact with those flood waters. So first and foremost, the FDA recommends doing an assessment. We will show you some assessment tools later. An assessment of the crop and the stage of the crop, evaluating the degree and the duration of the crop exposure to flood waters. And depending on those results, there might be some testing that we do and some soil testing that we, even looking at produce, at the product, to determine if that crop can be safely harvested or not. Most of the time, it is really difficult to be able to harvest a crop when it was when floodwaters came into a field. There's going to be many other factors, such as like actual contamination of the food harvest or the containers that we're using or our harvest bins. So it is very unlikely that we'll be able to harvest a crop, but the guidance does allow us to look into that. And then the next thing is like, the FDA does give guidance about what to do before replanting, okay? And first and foremost, the biggest thing to remember is that we should not replant flooded fields until the water has receded and the field has completely dried out, okay? Again, they do recommend conducting an assessment. And then the next and really important part, which we will go into in more detail, is like possibly waiting 30 to 60 days before, before replanting. And that is if we are only worried about microbiological or microbial contaminants, okay? We will, I think you have seen another presentation where we talk about other types of physical and chemical contaminants that might be of concern. But for microbial contaminants, we really are looking at 30 to 60 days. And there are reasons for that. And then the other thing is like preventing cross-contamination when working in that field. So, and this means that, you really want to stay away from those flooded areas, allow the ground to dry out. Or if you work in those areas, then making sure that you have a cleaning sanitation step on your equipment before you use that equipment in other parts of the farm that were not flooded. And we will also get into, probably the last part of this and the part where we are actually in our post Hurricane Helene, recovery, is like making sure that our water sources are safe for use to be used when in the growing, harvesting, packing activities and produce. So I just went through this, but here's a picture of a field, actually a beautiful raspberry field that got flooded under Hurricane Helene. You can see the evidence of like flood waters touching the edible portion of the crop. And there is the main thing, even though I already covered this, is to say that there's really no practical way to recondition produce that has been flooded. There's no way to wash it, even if you use the sanitizer. There's just not a practical way to remove contaminants that could have come in contact with flood waters. At this point in time, I do want to just make a distinction. We have had different storms. We have had different flood events. Hurricane Helene is not the first time that we see this kind of phenomena. What is possibly very different about Hurricane Helene and other storms is the widespread destruction and damage to our septic systems, to our wastewater treatment plants, So, and just vast flooding that allowed a lot of those contaminants that are never, or microbial pathogens that should never come in contact with our food supply, to actually have a perfect opportunity to now contaminate our fields, or contaminate the produce that was growing there. So that is why some of the actions and some of the information we're presenting, you might have not seen before, because we might have had minor floods that, even though they did come into fields, the extent of the damage was not as bad as what we saw this past October or September, late September into October. So I just want to briefly mention that we did see in some areas, especially not, I wouldn't say the hardest hit areas, but the peripheral counties, we did see a lot of fields that had some degree of damage, okay, where flood waters did come in contact to, or come by to parts of the fields and all that. And so those are actually a lot of the scenarios that we spend more time working with the growers and trying to determine the extent of the damage. So this, for example, here, like obviously this field was not destroyed, there was not total destruction. You can still see tomatoes standing. But what you do see is that if we look closely at the bed, you will see where actually floodwaters did at some point in time come in contact with those tomatoes. It also took a long time for these fields to dry out. I don't know if y'all remember, but even when we had about 30 days of no rain in most areas after the hurricane, I do have some pictures to show that the soil, depending on what happened, what sediment was deposited on top, that soil was still pretty wet after 30 days with no rainfall. So that is, something else to think about. The other part of this is like really, or the big part of our equation, and I feel the part that we really want to bring to light, is the fact that this time we really needed to be paying attention to what was happening, not just at our farm, but if we had flood waters, we needed to really look at what was happening in the vicinity, what was happening in adjacent land, what was happening a mile upstream, what are some of the things happening? And certainly we do not have large animal feeding operations, but we do have cattle. We do have, even when we have really good fences, we do have cattle, we have horses, we have other activities that definitely impacted water quality. So in areas where, we've normally have kept like really good fences and have not been worried about cattle, we did find that having cattle around, and obviously therefore having manure around, now when we had this flood events, what ended up happening is you basically had like a giant compost tea, kind of like your field just became a compost tea, because all those contaminants were coming in with flood water. So very, very important to recognize what was happening around you, what were, what did those flood waters bring? And in some areas, it's easier said than done. No question about that. The other thing is like, here's some, just, some immediate, I mean, as we look back, okay, what were some of the immediate things that we could have done, or that you can do whenever you have a flood event, and the first and foremost is like, obviously, we just talked about the fact that you don't want to go into flooded fields, and you want to prevent cross-contamination from those flooded areas to non-flooded areas. But the other thing is to make sure, and this is really important as we move on, is like to always segregate flood affected crops from non-affected, like, so if for whatever reason you have bins that got flooded, making sure like, or, you have produce that got flooded and it was in the field, making sure that that produce is not brought into areas where you have produce that is safe and that was not affected, and that is not cross-contaminated. The other thing, which we will get into a little later, is like to make sure that you clean and sanitize farm equipment. And in this extent, I would say if it's not a food contact surface, that you disinfect that equipment and tools that are used in those areas. That is extremely important. The other thing, and this comes from industry guidance, the FDA does allow us, like basically says that we should think about buffers. They don't give us a number, but the research from UC Davis, and then research from University of Arizona and research done out west shows that a 30-foot buffer is definitely needed in most areas. And that has to do with the way water moves underground, how flood waters move and the extent of how that happens. So do consider that as you are working on those, especially after a flood, it is important to keep a buffer between those areas to prevent cross-contamination from one section to the other. And again, we'll get into a little later about like testing our wells, assessing surface water, and looking at public, like in this case, like for us, city water was, impacted by like these extended boiling water notices. So we'll talk about what that means. Another part of I just want to mention this, like, but another important part to kind of think about is like if you have read or if you really pay attention to the FDA guidance does allow us to assess crops that even though they were flooded at the time of the flood, they might have not had the edible portion of the crop was not developed. Okay, so we did have some of those instances and in our area, okay, we did have some you know, um, crops like this. And so we did actually, those were the areas where we did pursue testing, where we did go in and try to not just look at what was happening in the area, but we also went in and did like a whole soil testing protocol that I'm going to talk about in a minute to really try to better understand if any contamination had a contamination event had happened. So do you know that it is really important to take pictures of when the flood happened, pictures of where the crop was, have all the records so that so that we can reconstruct those steps and see what is the best course of action when you have like a crop, like think of strawberries or, cabbage, that are early in their season. And with this, I'm going to make a distinction. If we look at cabbage, probably that cabbage was about probably 60 days from harvest, maybe. When the flood water happened, you couldn't really see the edible portion of the crop, but then think of like a crop like strawberries where fields that had been flood that were just recently planted before the storm, those crops are not going to be harvested till like maybe 4 to 5 6 months after the flood. So you have two different scenarios, and that is why it is important to recognize that we need to do these assessments and we need to be thorough with them so that we can make sure that ultimately the crop that we're going to sell is safe. So here is a link to the flood assessment tool that we use from California LGMA. So LGMA is the California Leafy Greens Marketing Agreement. They have provided the industry with amazing resources. Obviously, these are designed for the greens industry, but they are a great tool. They're simple, fairly simple to fill out, and they kind of helped us collect all the information we needed so that we can make decisions and help growers make decisions. So just this is one of many resources that they have provided us with. So I think you have heard me more than once say we need to do an assessment, and that's what we did in these fields. And now we're going to get on to the question about why do we wait? Why do we need to wait 30 to 60 days after a flood event before we go in and replant these fields? Okay. So I think I have covered, this is like, basically the FDA is asking you that before you make decisions about replanting, that you follow all these things. And we have, to an extent, talked about all of them. What I'm going to get into in the next few slides is talking about soil and water testing and sampling. So we will talk about that and how we did it and why we did it and how do if you're still interested in doing some soil testing, how to go about doing that. So we wait 30 to 60 days because especially with Hurricane Helene, there was no question that there was a high chance that the flood waters had contaminants from human waste. We are really worried about, again, septic systems, sewage lines. Okay, those are probably the number two, the two top things that we're really concerned about. The next thing was like animal waste. So anytime we have animal waste, that means we're going to probably have pathogens. That is how E. coli, that is how salmonella, that's how these bad guys that can potentially make someone sick come into our food supply. So we knew there was a really high chance that they were there. And we know from research that it takes anywhere from 30 to 60 days, which a lot of these pathogens will die 30 days after a flood event. Okay. But again, given our conditions and the picture here that I have, I actually purposely chose that. So this is where you can see the layer of silt that was deposited into a production field. And that layer was completely dry, okay? Completely dry, like looked like a brick. But when we just basically dug a little bit into it, this is a picture that was taken, I think, 32 days after the flood. You can see where the soil was completely moist and like the moisture level was like almost ideal. So if it's ideal, it means it's ideal for microbial growth, So we, in that case, we did a sampling, and at 32 days, 33 days, we were able to recover some pathogens from, I mean, actually, we were able to recover pathogens from a field, meaning, and we did find some of minor concern, which was not unusual because we were just at day 30. But that is why you allow time. You allow time for microbial die-off, knowing that by day 60, these pathogens have really, there's enough and sufficient time for them to completely die off. The other thing is that we're not just concerned about sewage, but we're also concerned about what's happening in adjacent land. And again, for fields where cattle might have been nearby, so whatever manure was present and then floodwaters hit it, those pathogens in that manure could very easily move into the field. So no matter if we have great fences that work obviously to keep livestock out of our production fields, but the floodwaters did move a lot of pathogens in. And then the other thing is that we did see significant number of mortalities from like livestock as a result of the storm. So that is another source of microbial pathogens that we knew we had to account for. So depending on the degree of contamination, the severity of the flooding in the field, we truly strictly recommended that most farmers wait at least 60 days before replanting their fields. And again, the testing that we did in some of the produce farms where we visited really supported this, that it was important to wait, to give time for basically the temperatures, like, they were dropping. We still had a pretty warm fall, but temperatures really, obviously, as the temperature drops, bacterial growth drops. Like just giving UV light, the sun, time for it to work and the elements, and then giving other bacteria time to also help reduce these bad microbial pathogens populations. So that is why we recommend, and our testing basically showed that it is granted to wait 30 to 60 days before replanting a field. So the other thing, and this is really what I think you probably will have by the time you listen to this presentation, you will have listened to Dr. Steph Galusha's presentation, but was that we were concerned about the possibility of heavy metals and other contaminants making its way to our soils. So in collaboration with them, we understood, okay, that before we ever even got into the fields and try to work the fields and try to help those soils dry out, that it was really, really important to test for heavy metals in areas, not in all areas, but in areas where we suspected that major flooding occurred and that there was the possibility of contaminants. And so we followed, for our own protocol, we followed the heavy metal testing recommendations from the NC State Soil Strike team. So we did, for all the samples we did for our farms, okay, considering these farms are growing produce, okay, we submitted all those samples to commercial labs. So that does make the process a little more expensive, but we needed definite quick answers to take action. And so we obviously, when we submitted samples, we did not submit composite samples. We submitted 2 to 3 samples from every field, and these are the heavy metals that we tested for, again, following in line with the recommendations from the Soil Strike team. So in our situation for the produce farms that we tested, we did not find any elevated numbers on these. So once we had those results in hand, we proceeded to do other, to then do, if possible, do any soil prep or, try to help the soil dry out or but we did not recommend doing any activities in those fields until we had the results for heavy metal testing on hand. So I do, as we move into soil testing and what we did to assess the microbial contamination in soils, I do want to just kind of show you another resource and kind of bring to light or give you a perspective of how these resources from California LGMA were developed. So the FDA provides us with very general guidance. Okay, they give you general guidelines, general things that you should be looking at before you make decisions after a flood. But they certainly did not give us any very specific recommendations. So the produce industry basically took it upon themselves to try to refine those recommendations and provide the industry with here are guidelines that we can use that are doable and that will really help us make better decisions. So this is one of the posters that has come, that they have provided, and you can obviously access this. We can provide you with these resources, but this is the stuff of the kind of information we shared after the storm. So one of the protocols that they have released, okay, and this protocol is specifically designed to help us make replanting decisions. So basically, it requires that we conduct an assessment, and after you conduct that assessment and determine where flooding happened, what crops were affected, then basically what we're going to do is we're going to pull 20 soil samples from a field, and out of those 20 representative soil samples, we're going to test 10 of them, we're going to look at an indicator, or sorry, 10 of, let me see, we could short the period. So some of those samples are going to be tested, or the 20 samples are going to be, sorry about this, 20 samples are going to be tested for generic E. coli, and then 10 out of the 20 samples we submitted for pathogen targets. So in this case, E. coli 0157H7 for Salmonella and for STEC. We submitted 10 of those samples for that. So this is a protocol that, it's just here summarized in one piece of paper, but it's a pretty labor intensive activity. So you do have to collect all the samples on the same day. You need to make sure that those samples are iced down and sent overnight to a lab, and obviously hoping that those samples make it to the lab before 24 hours so that they can be analyzed. This is not a mandatory protocol. This is a protocol, again, that is more like an industry guidance, and this is what we use to make determinations of where those fields were. Did we find, if we found any of these 3 pathogens, that obviously raised the flag. And it helped us kind of make decisions, help the growers make decisions that's about early replanting, or, or look at the condition of the field moving forward. So this is not mandatory. That's the other important thing. This is something we would do when we were really trying to find answers or try to have a better idea of what kind of microbial contamination we could have in that field. So the other just thing I want to mention is that we were able to do this in some of the farms because of the funding we got from the Empowering Mountain Farming, the systems grant from, that is administered by Dr. Laura Loeffler. And if we had not had access to those funds, it would have been really challenging. This is a protocol that just doing one round of samples is about $1,200 plus overnight shipping for these very heavy this very heavy samples. So if you're ever interested in doing something like this, I would ask you to please reach out to your county agent and work with our team to help you do this. This is not something you want to do on your own. We really were trying to work hard to find areas that were representative and that could really show us if there was microbial contamination. The testing of microbial contaminants is not as straightforward and it's not as easy as you would think. And this is why I have this slide here, because a lot of times we, again, like you can think about, if you think about it, we submitted 20 samples per production field that got flooded. So that's a lot of samples, and we did get a lot of negatives, and we realized, okay, based on the assessment, that there was reason to believe there's contaminants, but when you test, you're not always going to recover pathogens. There could be die-off that happens during transport. There could be die-off that happens, or there are things, even the method that the lab is using can become a problem. So it is a very complex, I would say, like, it's not a straightforward. And the other part of this is that we really needed to be paying attention to how we were doing the testing, how we were keeping those samples during, from the moment you recollect them till the moment you ship them, and even after that, just to make sure that we were doing everything, the protocol was being conducted in the right way. And when we did find, when we had a presence of one of these pathogens, we really paid attention to that, again, because of the really just how difficult it is to recover pathogens from soil samples. So my thing to you is, like, if you submit sample, if you do your assessment, and for example, you will have nearby animal activities, or you had massive destruction of septic systems, even if all your samples came back negative, you still have to consider that the results from your assessment far outweigh the results, the negative results you would get from soil testing. Okay, soil testing is just another layer to help you verify what's in the field, or try to find, but it's not an easy science. And so we really had we really I really feel like I needed to share this with you, because we did have growers submit samples, and all their samples were negative, and yet we know that there is a good chance that you could have had microbial contaminants, again, especially in those first 30 days after a flood event. Okay. So with that, I do want to say something to kind of wrap this discussion up, and it's the fact that after 60 days, okay, all the research actually shows that microbial die-off should happen. So if we have gone to a field and we have, if we suspected that there's a need to do heavy metal testing, and we did, and we had all negative, we found basically numbers that were not of concern. So we proceeded to share with the grower that it was okay to go ahead and, like, work the soil and try to get that soil to dry out as much as possible. When you have a soil that has that layer of silt, the soil is not going to dry out on its own. It's going to need to be worked, and that's what's going to speed up actually the the microbial die-off in the field. So once that happens, as long as you wait 60 days, and that should be fine. You do not need to do any further testing. And if you again did testing, it was just trying to find out if it was safe to replant before 30 days, or before that 60-day period happened. So now I do want to talk about water sources, because this is the area that actually is of most concern, or was really and truly of most concern after the storm for us. Okay. And so I just want to mention that anytime city water or municipal water tends to be very stable. Okay. The quality is very stable. Municipalities do a really good job for the most part of making sure that we have water that is free of microbial contaminants. But in periods where you have, like, if there's ever a boiling water notice, it is really important to pay attention to that. So what happens is, when you have a boil water notice, you cannot use this water safely to wash produce. You cannot use it during harvest activities, and you cannot use it for hand washing if you are in the produce in produce production. Okay. So at that point in time, we did at times recommend that, like, basically the answer at that point in time is either you get potable water, or water that of adequate quality from another source, or you can treat your water. So there is only basically one product that is labeled for that, and then it's Sanidate 15. So you would be using it at a very small rate, but that would allow you to treat that water so where it's safe. And it was really hard to get Sanidate 15 during this storm. So that is something that I hope that in the future will change, because that's certainly at least one of the avenues we have right now. Um, If you have city water, you can also UV light meters will also work. They UV light works, that is a way of treatment, and that does work in water that's not turbid. So if you have like city water would be a good candidate for that. You can use UV light to, as long as the system is properly designed and implemented and those light bulbs are working, that is one way to do a treatment on, like, on city water. But you would have to make sure, you would need to test that water after it's gone through that treatment to make sure that the treatment is effective and that it's working. Now, here's the part where for farms, I do want to make sure that everyone, kind of raise a sort of like a warning. And it's that if you did have wells that were flooded or submerged for at least, I would say, for extended periods of times, but even if it was a whole day or a couple of days, those are wells that, as you have worked on them, and I hope that you have already inspected them and purged them and disinfected them or shocked them. But even if you did that process, it will be important to monitor the water quality and to test those wells possibly more than once in the coming months. Okay, so if you already did all this process and you tested your well, I would recommend you test it again in a couple months or in a month. We really want to make sure that that there was not major contamination, because it is a challenge when you have submerged wells, and problems can arise later and basically you can have persistent contamination in submerged wells. We did ask growers to test their wells after the storm. And for example, large packing houses that were still in season, that was our recommendation at the time. And we did not see any major problems. Actually, we didn't see, I think there might have been a few wells that had to be shocked, but we did not see. And again, and this is on wells that were not flooded. But we did ask everyone to do that just to make sure, again, to ensure that the water was safe after such a devastating event. But for those growers that had flooded up submerged wells, we want to make sure that you realize that there could be issues with persistent contamination, especially in heavy hit areas by the storm. So that is really important. And what do you test for? You test for produce, you test for generic E. coli. And what you're looking for is a zero value. We get a lot of growers or people calling and saying, well, I got zero generic E. coli, but I have coliforms, or what do I do? And really, coliforms can come from different sources and they don't really tell us much. Yes, we do not want to have coliforms in our wells, but the number that is really critical is like that zero generic E. coli. Or you can get a drinking water test through your through your the lab. So either one, basically, but we in the industry, this is the number that we use. So what about ponds, rivers, lakes? What about surface water? This was another one that was like really, really hard, because we have had, for the most part, farm ponds tend to have very stable water quality. And a lot of our farms do rely on like farm ponds and small creeks, but our rivers are a different story, right? And so surface water under food safety rules is all kind of seen as like this very high risk water source. Okay, that anything that's like, why? Because it's open to the elements, because it can be easily contaminated, and because really there's not a lot we can do to control that. So during the storm, we did discourage everyone from using surface water for any water that would come in contact with the edible portion of the crop. That could be even for irrigation water, until an assessment was performed on the surface water. So we are actually, that's one area where we're still working and trying to figure out things. As you can tell, if you've been out there, you'll see that most of our rivers have turned back to, especially in the winter, they're crystal clear. They look really good. They don't look like the way they did at the storm. On the other hand, we have a lot of farm ponds that still look pretty murky. Okay, and the amount of sediment in a body of water does not necessarily correlate with water quality. I do have to say that. So This is where if you do if you do use surface water for your production, for fruit and vegetable production, I would strongly recommend you reach out to us and let's do an assessment of your water. To look at it and see what, a lot has changed, okay? A lot, so it is important to really look at these water sources and determine the safety. And the challenge with this is that the FDA did come out with a ruling last July where basically this for the pre-harvest water requirements for produce farms. And what this new rule in a nutshell says is that for the longest time we have relied on water testing, and we would normally if a grower told me, well, I'm using the French Broad River, where we would tell him go and pull samples from the French Broad River 3 times during the season and and look at those results. And if those results were under the below the EPA recreational water standards, we would basically say, okay, this water is okay. Well, we know that that is not necessarily the case. So that is where the assessment of the water source, the water distribution system, and to be able to acknowledge how that water is being used. So if you are using drip irrigation in your farm and you're using surface water, at least the drip irrigation will obviously help reduce the risk, because water should technically, depending on what you're growing, may or may not come in contact with the edible portion of the crop. But if you have surface water and you are overhead irrigating, like a garden or a produce garden or a produce field, you're growing greens, that is a different story. That really raises the risk level. So this is where I would strongly recommend that if you're using surface water, please reach out to your county agent and we will try to do our best to help you figure out what would be the best strategy to reduce, any chances of contamination from water sources. And the other thing about like surface water is that we were concerned about microbial, chemical, and physical contaminants at the time of the storm, not just bacteria, not just E. coli, not just salmonella, not listeria. There was so many things that happened that and we recognize that water quality can get back to, water quality eventually will be okay, but that doesn't happen until you have enough dilution of those contaminants. And the other thing is, like, you do have to be aware that contaminants, the probably on our end, one thing that really helped is that when the flood events happen, the strength of the water just moved fast, so fast that a lot of those contaminants probably didn't stay in our area, okay? But wherever the sediments were deposited on the edge of the fields and all that, those are the areas that we can be of concern. So if you can, we also recommended that if at the time that if growers were using surface water, or now that like to consider treatment of like water treatment. And at this point in time, you do have to use a chemical treatment. You would have to use something like peracetic acid, hydrogen peroxide. So that would be like Sanidate 12. That is a different formulation. That is, on the other hand, the only product that is currently labeled for water treatment for pre-harvest water, for basically to reduce pathogens of public health concern. And so you can use other, there are other treatment systems, but that is the only label one. So that will be something to consider. And again, this is a case by case. This is like something every farm would decide. As we wrap up this presentation, I just briefly want to mention that anything that any equipment that we use in our farms that could come in contact with flood waters needs to be properly cleaned, sanitized, and at times, may need to be disinfected. And so let's talk about what these three are, okay? And just very briefly, but anything that came in contact with floodwaters that was like that is used in your production. So this could be harvest bins, harvest crates, anything like that. All those food contact surfaces need to be clean. And when I refer to cleaning, it means to the complete removal of soil and food residues from the surfaces. And we want to reduce, like, that will help with reducing biofilms, and it will really help. This cleaning process needs to be done in such a way that, we away from production areas, away from where you're going to be growing, and this will really help so that the sanitizing and this, if you have to disinfect, areas, that will happen correctly. So, yeah, for the most part, in the produce industry, we never disinfect any food contact surfaces. We only sanitize them. And how do we sanitize a surface? We use the chemical and a chemical sanitizer, such as like food grade chlorine or food grade, like Sanidate 5.0 would be a product we would use for this. We would mix it according to the instructions for sanitizing food contact surfaces. And what that process is going to do is that it's going to kill any bacteria or reduce bacteria by 99.9%. And it will help, basically now you will have a surface that is sanitary. And this really obviously reduces the risk of environmental condition. You can clean, plastic, you can clean PVC, you can clean, different materials, you can clean wood. You can only sanitize non-porous materials. Okay, so you can sanitize plastic bins, you can sanitize RPCs, plastic crates, but you cannot sanitize wood. So one thing, if you did have bins that were, came in contact with flood waters, we did recommend to a lot of growers to take those bins, obviously remove them from the areas that were flooded, and pressure. That's probably one of the only times you'll hear me talk about pressure washing, but to pressure wash those bins and let them completely air dry before using them. Because, you cannot sanitize wood. So that is important to recognize. The only reason I mentioned that at times we would have, I would have considered disinfecting some of these food contact surfaces is if you know that you had plastic bins or crates or harvest equipment that could have specifically come in contact with like human waste or animal waste. And so, because there are other things other than bacteria, like viruses and other things that the disinfection process will take care of. But anytime we try not to ever disinfect food contact surfaces because that leaves a chemical residue. So the way you do this is if you did have food contact surfaces that were heavily, heavily contaminated, that were just in contact with really nasty contaminants, we would come in, you would clean them, and then you would disinfect them, and then you would use a potable water rinse. And this is no different of what you would do if, for example, you had an employee and they are harvesting and all of a sudden someone vomits or vomit comes in contact with a food container. So at that point in time, you would wash that container, you would clean it, and then you would disinfect it, let it air dry, and then you would use a potable water rinse to discard of any chemical. So again, do before the season starts. If you were in areas where you had flooding, I would clean and I would thoroughly sanitize all my equipment that comes directly in contact with the produce. That should be something we do already, but I just want to bring to light that it is more important than ever to do that. And we do have workshops about cleaning and sanitation. And if you need help, that is something we'll be glad to help you through the county agents. And I just also want to make sure that you recognize, so germicidal bleach is a food grade product, okay? Here on my, on your, on the left of the screen, that is a product that has a specific label for sanitizing. So like, for example, I believe most of these labels that for food grade Clorox will say 2 teaspoons per gallon of water. If you look at that same label, it would have instructions on how to mix it for disinfecting a surface, and that would be something like 1/3 of a cup or higher. So those are two very different instructions, and in this case, you want to be very precise when you are mixing these chemicals for this. On the other hand, I want to make you aware that we do not recommend the use of any sanitizers or any cleaners that are not food grade. So here you have totally awesome bleach, which I am sure it's awesome, but it's not labeled for, it does not have a label for use in food contact surfaces. It has a fresh scent, meaning that you do not want to use any scents in food grade product, to clean your harvest containers. So this is a product that we would not recommend. The other here is, just as we wrap up this discussion, here are, for example, the very specific instructions for using Sanidate 5.0. And again, if you need help, please reach out. But that product has a very specific label on how do you use it to sanitize food contact surfaces. How do you mix it, the contact time, and, allowing that product to dry off. Again, if we were ever needing this product to disinfect, okay, for the most part, non-food contact surfaces, we would use a different set of instructions, and you can see the differences between exposure time and concentration in those two procedures. But in the food industry, our goal is to only sanitize food contact surfaces, to clean them and sanitize them. With that, if you need help, okay, we know we have reached a lot of growers, but we have not reached everyone. And if you still feel you need help with assessing damage from a food safety standpoint, from a microbial standpoint, please reach out to your county agent or reach out, to me directly, and I'll work with your county agent to help you do that before the next season starts, in identifying risk. If you need help, not just with a flood assessment, but with a water assessment to determine if your water sources are, adequate, or if there's anything we need to fix before the new season starts, please do not hesitate to reach out, or, how to use some of these cleaning and sanitation products that I just talked about. And with that, here are some of the resources. Here's like videos that we'll be glad to share with you. But this is where we got all the information that we were able to use, and again, all of this is research-based information to make decisions after Hurricane Helene. And with that, here are a couple of more or other workshops we'll be having. So we are having a cleaning sanitation workshop in Salisbury on April 2nd. And we will be specifically discussing how to implement the final pre-harvest water rule for covered farms. And we're having a meeting for tree fruit growers in Hendersonville, April 22nd, and one for growers that grow all other vegetables in Waynesville. And that has to do with the differences in how we use water in those, in those two, in those different crops. And then every year we do a food safety update. And for that, we basically go through all the different things, okay, all the different changes, so anything that's relevant. And so for those of you who are GAP certified, this is like an opportunity to get a certificate. I do want to say, I should have mentioned this earlier, but if you have a food safety plan, if you are GAP audited, GAP certified, it is important. The auditor will probably ask you, what actions did you take after Hurricane Helene, especially if your farm was flooded. So I would strongly recommend documenting any actions that you took on behalf of, after the storm. How did you, prevent microbial contamination, or to address any microbial contamination issues. So with that, here is our website, and NC Fresh Produce Safety. If you we post our workshops there and our classes, and we do have supplementary information. So please visit our website, and here's my contact information.